Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. In what appears to be a concerted action, the international community stepped up efforts to reinforce sanctions against North Korea, seeking to rein in the country's nuclear ambitions. Meanwhile, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said the nuclear weapons guarantee the permanent safety, signaling once again that he's not willing to give up the arsenal. We'll discuss these and more. Joining us today is Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. O'Hanlon specializes in the U.S. defense strategy and national security policy. He authored numerous books, including Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He is a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Young-Kyo.
Nice to be with you.
A complaint submitted to a UN Security Council committee said during the first 5 months of this year, North Korea has already breached a cap on imports of refined petroleum. 43 countries signed this complaint. Mr. O'Hanlon, let me start with you. Can we interpret this as a move to tighten a grip on North Korean sanctions?
Well, I think the sanctions enforcement process is an ongoing struggle. My own view is that the sanctions regime is imperfect, but actually, on balance, moderately effective for the purposes that we're trying to achieve. The purpose, of course, is not to punish North Korea, nor is the purpose to make the country completely impermeable to any and all movement of goods. We're trying to create enough economic pressure to make North Korea reassess its calculus about what kind of a nuclear deal it would consider. That's the key purpose of these sanctions, and I do believe they've been working well enough to create some diplomatic opportunities. I think the Trump administration has done a poor job in recent months exploiting those opportunities, but that's not really the fault of the sanctions per se. So yes, there's a long ways to go. Yes, we need improvement and constant vigilance, but this is not a failed policy. The sanctions are causing perhaps 3 to 4% negative real growth each year in North Korea, and that creates some pressure.
Mr. Snyder, do you agree to this?
Yeah, I agree, but the key issue that really is being focused on is essentially a flouting of sanctions by member states, China and Russia. And I think that what's really striking is that we have 43 countries that are going on record pointing their finger at other member states who have essentially enabled and allowed these ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum to go forward. And the fact that this is the second year suggests that it's a significant step where we have member states who have agreed to enforcement of an aspect of the sanctions regime that they're actually not implementing.
One of the cited reasons that China and Russia are having difficulties implementing sanctions was that these two countries have problems in translating metric tons into barrels. Mr. Snyder, is this a proper excuse, or are China and Russia really trying hard to cover for North Korea?
Yeah, I think that the excuse of not being able to do math is kind of a silly excuse to block the fact that China and Russia are not adequately implementing the sanctions regime. And I think the real problem is that the Sanctions Committee has been presented with photographic evidence and detailed evidence that this is an ongoing effort that probably involves complicity with Chinese authorities. Certainly they are aware, and yet nothing has been done about it.
Mr. O'Hanlon, you earlier mentioned about how North Korea's economy was hit by these sanctions, but how serious is it right now?
My own sense is that, the sanctions are sort of causing about half as much pain as they might if they were being fully and properly implemented. I have to admit that I'd be nervous if they were completely airtight, in the sense that I'm not sure Kim Jong-un could tolerate that. And I'm not sure if he wouldn't return to the brinkmanship of 2017. There's always the possibility North Korea could wind up not so much deliberately attacking the United States or South Korea perhaps, but trying brinkmanship in order to grab the world's attention for a situation that it found intolerable.
This week, UK's regulator has issued guidance highlighting North Korea's sanctions evasion behaviors in maritime trade. And EU's first cyber sanctions included a North Korean firm, which is believed to be behind cyber attacks such as WannaCry.
I think that the story about the European Union applying sanctions for cyber activities, this is new, and I think it's important that the Europeans are taking this step because the next step, perhaps in the North Korean sanctions evasion manual, really has been very focused on building up cyber theft capabilities. And it's clear that this is both a problem and it's seemingly an effective means by which North Korea has been able to raise cash in order to get around some of its economic difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to shift our focus to U.S. military exercises in the Indo-Pacific region. The South Korean government has confirmed that South Korea and the United States will stage a major annual exercise this summer. There is still much speculation over the scale of the joint military exercise, which has drawn keen attention following the cancellation of the spring exercise due to the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. O'Hanlon, how important is the scale of the exercise at this particular moment?
Well, I've been of the view for a long time that we can actually make do without the big exercises. And as long as we replace them with a lot of smaller exercises. And in some ways, the big exercises have almost a theater-like quality to them. They have to be elaborately choreographed because they involve so many people. And you need hotel rooms for people. You need to not bottle up roads. And so there is a certain artificiality to the big exercises. And I actually think for combat preparedness, a lot of small exercises may be just as good. Now, there's a debate about that within military circles. Not everyone agrees with me. I would acknowledge that. I would also acknowledge there is a political issue about what message you are sending by being willing to do a moratorium on big exercises. But on balance, I think that if we have a de facto tacit understanding with North Korea that they're not going to do long-range missile and nuclear tests and we're not going to do big exercises, that's a good deal for us. I think the value that we get from the moratorium on North Korean ICBM and nuclear testing is actually much more valuable to us than any kind of mitigation of U.S. ROK combat capability that may result from an indefinite suspension of large exercises. So I would be very careful about jeopardizing what's become, I think, a tacit understanding between the two sides on that point. And I would try to keep these exercises fairly modest in scale.
Yeah, well, Mike makes some excellent points, especially about the risks of avoiding igniting a renewed cycle of escalation by trying to ramp up exercises in a way that might induce a North Korean escalatory response. But at this moment, it seems that the COVID virus has taken the issue of large-scale exercises off the table. And the other factor is that so far we haven't seen North Korea really responding diplomatically. And so I do think that we have a dilemma in terms of how to effectively ensure readiness. I agree with Mike that the revised exercise plans appears to be satisfactory from a readiness perspective for USFK. But the political signaling right now is very complicated because North Korea has been so reticent to come to the negotiating table.
Right. In the meantime, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made remarks that the country's nuclear deterrence will permanently guarantee national security. Mr. O'Hanlon, is this statement aimed at future negotiations with the U.S.?
Well, it's been clear for a long time, I think, going back to my former colleague Jonathan Pollock's book about North Korea's nuclear program 10 years ago, and probably much longer than that, and I think Scott's written about this, the North Korean regime is very committed to its nuclear program. And it would take a lot for Kim Jong-un to give it up. I don't overinterpret any one comment of that type, but it's consistent with longstanding North Korean dedication to sustain its nuclear program. For Kim Jong-un, it would almost be a repudiation of the family legacy, as my colleague Jung Pak wrote in her great book that came out this year on Kim Jong-un. And also it would be throwing away the wisdom that the North Korean regime gained when it watched Saddam Hussein be overthrown because in part he didn't have nuclear weapons. Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown when he did not have nuclear weapons. The Taliban were overthrown in Afghanistan. They also lacked nuclear weapons. The lesson seems to be don't risk being in a war with the United States if you don't have a nuclear deterrent. And so until North Korea would have a great deal of confidence that there was a permanent peace regime that it could rely upon on the Korean Peninsula, it's not going to give up its nuclear arsenal, or at least not the entirety of the arsenal. Now, my view is North Korea has nothing to fear from the United States or South Korea, so it should be willing to give up its arsenal. But that's my conclusion sitting here in Washington, D.C., and that's not the way that the North Korean leadership tends to think. So I believe that we have to expect that it's going to take a lot to persuade them otherwise. And the more realistic negotiating path, therefore, in my opinion, is to try to eliminate their ability to make more nuclear weapons with a verifiable dismantlement of their production capability in exchange for a partial lifting of sanctions. I think that is the realistic goal. And Kim's comments just reaffirm that that is, I think, the more realistic and viable way to move forward, at least in the short term.
Mr. Snyder, what did you take away from Kim Jong-un's remarks?
Well, I think that what the North Koreans have been looking for a long time is a way to address their vulnerability to U.S. Nuclear capabilities. And so what was very interesting, I think, in Kim Jong-un's statement is his emphasis on the idea that mutual deterrence can help make North Korea safer. But it's not clear that the U.S. is willing to embrace mutual deterrence with North Korea. And it's also concerning that North Korea still, in conventional terms, and more broadly, remains relatively weak and has so few tools in its arsenal for response. And so what I worry about with North Korea's nuclear capability is that in any case where tensions rise, the only tool in North Korea's tool bag now is the nuclear option. And that's not, I think, a very stable situation for North Korea to always be going to nuclear threats in response to potential rising tensions.
Mm-hmm. So many analysts agree that it shows that Pyongyang is not willing to give up its nuclear program. But Mr. O'Hanlon, will the U.S. ever accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state?
No, I don't think so. Not officially, not de jure. I would never think the United States should accept that formally. It would have implications not only for Northeast Asia, but for global nonproliferation principles. And therefore, the best we can do and the most we can do, I think, is sort of look away, tacitly acknowledge we're not going to be able to get rid of that weapons capability in the short term and focus on more achievable goals for the foreseeable future.
Mr. Snyder, in the short term, how will the U.S. manage this kind of pressure tactics from North Korea? How will it respond, especially with the presidential election just 3 months away?
Well, honestly, I think that the immediate desire of the Trump administration is just to wait until after the election. Obviously, for a potential Biden administration, that also involves waiting. And so in many respects, I think the question is, what steps is North Korea taking to set up for a re-engagement in the spring of 2021? And how do we interpret North Korea's goals in the context of that re-engagement? And here I think that what the North Koreans really want to do is to present themselves as an entrenched nuclear state in an effort to actually take denuclearization off the agenda for a new administration. I think Mike has indicated very good reasons why that is probably not going to be possible from the U.S. side, but I do think that what North Korea really wants is détente, not denuclearization, while the U.S. continues to insist that détente can only occur in the context of denuclearization.
Well, in the run-up to the U.S. presidential election, we'll have to see if North Korea does attempt to create an event to draw the attention from the U.S. Mr. O'Hanlon and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's edition of Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis. Goodbye.